Hello everyone, we are presenting our team project for a vulnerability scan with OpenVAS. OpenVAS, it's a scanner that uses to scan systems against vulnerability. The vulnerability found in each system is compared to a public field. That public field is built into that scanner, and it compared and get updated daily with the newest vulnerability around the globe to make sure all the new vulnerability is addressed when it's found. OpenVAS went through a major change in 2017, and it became part of a big module on the Greenbone vulnerability management, and it changed their name from Open Vulnerability Assessment System to Open Vulnerability Assessment Scanner. Same thing as the public feed went through a rename as well, and it became the Greenbone Community Feed. OpenVAS uses two methods to scan any system: unauthenticated and authenticated. The authenticated method doesn't give much of scanning because it doesn't get full access of the system. Doesn't scan the memory, doesn't scan the file system, it doesn't scan every part of the system. When on the other hand, the full access one with the credential being provided and built into OpenVAS, give OpenVAS full access to the system and be able to pull all the vulnerability that is found in that system, in each corner of the system. In our project, we scanned three virtual machines. The first machine was Kali Linux, Metasploitable. 3 was the second, and finally we scanned also the Windows 10 virtual machine. We used the Kali Linux and Windows 10 that was in a sandbox connected to a LAN network, and the Metasploitable 3 was connected to sandbox network. Kali Linux and Windows 3, we use the full credential scanning to get full access of the system and pull all the vulnerability that is found. The top 10 vulnerability that were found on these three systems, we determined that we are addressing two vulnerability from Kali system and 8 from the Metasploitable 3. These are the vulnerability that need to be addressed because it's actually threatening the system, and if it's being exploited, that will give the attacker full access of the system. The first vulnerability we are addressing is the jQuery, the versions below 1.9. This vulnerability was found on Kali Linux, and it was early found in 2018. And it makes the system vulnerable to any cross-site scripting attacks. And early of this version of the jQuery, any version that was prior to 1.9, the module logged on the greater than sign on the HTML, and if it is found on the payload, it gives the attacker the ability to modify the payload, and whenever that greater than sign in any part of the load, it gives the attacker, if it has been exploited, the access. Once the payload is modified, the attacker would have access to the system without using any authentication or needing any credential to get into the system. Therefore, the recommended fix for this vulnerability is updating the jQuery module or function to a newer version above 1.9. Any version below the 1.9 will contain that vulnerability and will give will have the system under that threat. Therefore, updating the system for any version above 1.9 to ensure the system is addressed, or that vulnerability is addressed and being taken care of. Second vulnerability we're addressing today is the missing Linux kernel mitigations for speculative store bypass hardware vulnerabilities. This vulnerability was first discovered on Kali Linux in early 2018. That vulnerability is basically gives an attacker, when it exploits the vulnerability, it gives the attacker full access of the a privileged area of the memory that shouldn't be accessible, because basically the CPU is given access through the cache memory, as we see on the figure next to the presentation. Most of the CPUs are vulnerable to this cache memory error, and therefore, to mitigate the issue, system administrator must apply a hardware and a software fix. Hardware would include the microcoding of the microprocessor itself to address the vulnerability, and on the same side, addressing the firmware and addressing the software by batching the software and be up to date, so that privilege is being denied or not given to this attacker. If the kernel update by itself applied without the appropriate firmware or microcoding of the microprocessor, unfortunately, that vulnerability is not sufficient, and the vulnerability will still can be executed at some certain level. The Apache Tomcat AGB vulnerability, or in a short term called GhostCat. This is the third vulnerability we're addressing today. The vulnerability was early found in 2020. It's basically found in the Apache Tomcat versions of the 6, 7, 8, and 9 versions. They're running on most of the servers and give access to the attacker remotely if the exploit was if the vulnerability was exploited. The workaround that vulnerability is to give the either update the version of most of the servers around, because the Apache has been used on nearly 1 million servers around the globe, and remove the connector service line from the programming or the coding. On the workaround around this is also give a full access and accessing the port 8009 by authenticating using a credential and providing username and password to in order to able to listen to that port. Fourth vulnerability today we're addressing is the GNU Bash environment variable handling the RCE. This vulnerability was found on early 2014. The bash contains a flaw that is triggered when evaluating environment variables passed from another environment. Successful exploitation of this will allow remote or local access to inject a shell command and allow full access of the system. Therefore, the update of the GNU Bash version through 4.3 are affected, most of the versions, and any updated version above the 4.3 is recommended to ensure that vulnerability is addressed and that the risk has been taken away.
OpenSSH X11 forwarding security bypass vulnerability. This vulnerability allows remote authenticated users to bypass intended shell command restrictions via crafted X11 forwarding data. This vulnerability was found twice on port 22. The CVSS score is 9.8. The confidentiality impact is high, meaning if an attacker is successful in exploiting this issue, this allows local users to bypass certain security restrictions. Integrity impact is high, meaning the system can be compromised if an unauthorized user gains access. The availability impact is high. If breached, this will not allow access to admin users. The access complexity is low. An attacker can bypass the security criteria using simple tools. And the solution is to upgrade to OpenSSH to version 7.2 or greater. OpenSSH denial of service and user enumeration vulnerabilities. This is a Windows Server 2008 allows attackers to cause a denial of service via vectors involving special group and user enumeration. This was found on port 22. The CVSS score is 7.5. The confidentiality impact is high. This can allow remote attackers to cause a DOS attack. Integrity impact is high. It can increase the CPU impact and consumption. Availability impact is high. Timing will be increased when a user inserts a large password. Access complexity is low. A user can use automated tools to help exploit the enumeration vulnerabilities such as brute force attack. And the solution is to upgrade to OpenSSH version 7.3 or greater. MS15-034 HTTPS.sys remote code execution vulnerability. This allows remote attackers to execute arbitrary code via crafted HTTP requests, aka HTTP.sys remote code execution vulnerability. This vulnerability was found on port 80. The CVSS score is 10. The confidentiality impact is high. This can potentially reveal all files to an attacker. Integrity impact is high. Possible impact on full systems and loss of all protection on your system. Availability impact high. Attacker can prevent user to access any files or system on the machine. The access complexity is low. A user can use automated tools to help exploit the machine. And the solution, it is recommended to check the vendor for updates to help possibly resolve this issue.
One of the top 10 vulnerabilities we found when we used the OpenVAS to scan the Metaexploitable system. One of them was Oracle MSQL Security Update with the port number 3306. This allows low privilege attacks with network access on via multiple protocols to compromise the server. And this kind of attack usually leads to frequent crashes in the server. As we can see, the CVSS for this vulnerability is at high, which is 9.8. It doesn't have a considerable confidential impact. Also, it doesn't have integrity impact, but possesses a higher availability impact. When going through the report, it shows that no authentication is required to exploit this vulnerability. And the best solution and the best mitigation solution for this vulnerability is to fix the security patches. The next on the list is the Elasticsearch 1.61 multiple vulnerability window. This one is found on port 9200, and port 9200 is for all API calls. So every call we send through the HTTP is vulnerable. These attacks are vulnerable to an engineered on its transport protocol. So it's basically on this transport protocol. It enables the remote code execution. And when this kind of attacks are successful, the attacker is able to access the arbitrary files. After running the scan, this Elasticsearch appeared in two places, but they both have a different CVE code. The first one was ending with 3253, and the second one was ending with 5531. But I picked the 5531 because that's the one I'm talking about with the Windows system. But the second one is vulnerable to Linux operating system. It has a 9.8 CVS score, high in confidentiality impact. There are higher impact on the integrity of the system as well as availability impact. As we can see from the slide, there are no gain access to it, and no authentication is also required, just like the first MySQL. And the solution is for users to upgrade from the older version of 1.61 to 1.70, which is the recent updated version. And if a user doesn't want to go through the struggle or the stress of upgrading the system, because that might take a while, they said you can also secure the transport protocol, which is the port. The next one is the Microsoft Windows Remote Desktop Service. The remote code execution exists in RDS, and the Microsoft is prone to remote code execution, as it was shown in 2019. But this vulnerability is best known as Bluekeep. It's a wormable remote code, and its integrity impact is high. The confidential impact is high as well. There's no gain access to it. The access complexity is low, and the available impact is low. One of the mitigations found for this system is to be patched as soon as possible to not to enable it spread all over the system. And this is the conclusion that we have on the slide. He said we should name the overall changes to the network that we identified. So after going through the top 10 vulnerabilities, we all have similar vulnerability mitigations, and it is keeping the system up to date, continually monitoring emerging vulnerabilities, mitigate zero-day or publicly disclose vulnerabilities, also patching, blocking, and fixing vulnerabilities. So the overall is the vulnerability management remediation. That is to find the vulnerability, to prioritize it, to monitor it, and to fix it. Thank you.